fiddling, but it's intelligent, guided fiddling. And if you actually try to replicate that with a randomized controlled trial, you can't, because the dimensionality is too large. And I could talk about that technically, but I'm not going to. So seeing into the machine, as I call it, allows the village, the ministry, or the planning commission to make a better choice. It may be able to see whether it would work for them. They can see places where they could adapt it and make it better. And understanding the process and how it would work is the way that you go ahead. So there's no substitute for trial and error, local knowledge, and hard thought. Experimentation is obviously a good idea, but it doesn't necessarily have to be a randomized controlled trial. My friend Nancy Cartwright, with whom I've been working on these issues, she talks about helping factors. And this is a very useful concept. It's that if something worked in one place, you have to ask yourself, what were the helping factors that made it possible for it to work? So we've seen an example of this already, which are the clinics in Mexico. If you have a conditional cash transfer in India where there are no clinics, or very few open clinics, then that's not really going to help, and you're not going to get the same result. You know that in advance. That's an example of the helping factor. What about causality? Do not RCTs reveal causality? They do, but it turns out this causality is not tremendously helpful. Now, for many social scientists, that seems a really weird thing to say, that causality is not helpful because we sort of worship at the throne of causality. But an example of the sort of causality I have in mind is the following statement. The house burned down because the TV was left on. Okay? That's a causal statement, in that if the television had not been left on, the house would not have burned down. It really is what caused it. But it's not in the slightest bit general, because TVs do not usually burn down houses. RCT would show this causal effect. So if you had a million houses and some of them left the television on and some of them didn't, the ones with the TV on will burn down more often than the other ones. So, causal effect. But TVs need helping factors like bad wiring or inflammable materials nearby. And you have to know those helping factors for this to be really useful at all. And causality by itself is not worth very much. So we have to figure out what these things are. And I put another way, replication of RCTs is not very useful because you'll get different results in different contexts depending on whether the helping factors are operating. I wanted to show you this picture, which is a drawing by Rube Goldberg. I don't know how many of you can see this. And Nancy Cartwright uses this as an example of the sort of causality we're talking about here. What you have is a window on the left of the picture out of which someone's flying a kite. When the window is open, the kite flies in the wind. That pulls a string which opens the door on this sort of thing that holds cakes or whatever. Inside this box that holds cakes are a bunch of moths. The moths fly out and eat this shirt that's hanging there. When the shirt gets eaten, it becomes lighter, and it goes up in the air and lowers the shoe. The shoe comes on this lever. The lever switches on the iron, which is on a red flannel shirt on the ironing board. The hot iron starts to burn the shirt, and the smoke goes into the tree. When the smoke rises in the tree, there's a possum there, a sort of animal, a marsupial. It's living in the tree. It gets smoked out and jumps into the basket. The basket lifts the lid off the cage in which a woodpecker is sitting, and the woodpecker, released from its cage, sharpens the pencil. So this is called the new improved pencil sharpener. The knife that's hanging on the right there is there for an emergency. If the possum or the woodpecker gets sick and don't show up to work one day, you can sharpen the pencil with the knife. Now this is a strange machine, but it's entirely causal. And you can open the window to sharpen the pencil. If you build lots of machines like this, it might not work every time, but it'll work more times than when you don't have this machine. So it would satisfy a randomized controlled trial. But this is an example of the sort of causality you get from a randomized control trial. It's like the television burning down the house. It doesn't ordinarily happen. And it's not a very useful thing to know. No one would dream of sharpening pencils using a device like this. And when you see the results of a randomized control trial, you should bring similar skepticism as to whether this is a policy that should be used everywhere. So this, I think, is the last slide. There is an expanding literature on randomized controlled trials. Many of them run in India. And we now have enough RCT papers to judge their quality and then the evidence they find. Some of them are excellent, and some of them are terrible, which is just like other empirical papers in the literature. I don't think they're any better or any worse than other papers. But you have to read them skeptically. You have to ask, you know, what were the helping factors that made this work? Will those helping factors work for me? What was the sample size? Are the results credible? You know, all those sort of things. Was the sample on which the trial was run representative of the population on which we would actually write to do this policy? So these are exactly the same sort of questions that you would bring to any other study. There is no free pass just because they're randomized controlled trials. There is no hierarchy of evidence. And using the word rigorous evaluation as a code word for randomized controlled trials is really without justification. Rigor depends on the details of the study. And right now, in economics and in much of the aid literature, they're being given a free pass. And I'm not against randomized controlled trials. They certainly have their place. But they should not be given a free pass. And they certainly should not be used to automatically generalize from some tiny sample to the result being valid in the whole world. RCTs have no monopoly on rigor, and there is no gold standard. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Angus. Before I sort of go over to the discussant, let me introduce him. Shekhar Shah is currently the director of the National Council for Applied Economic Research. And he's come here from a time where he's been doing things not directly, but around this sort of an area. He was here in Delhi before and was part of some of the discussions we had leading up to our decision to set up an independent evaluation organization. Indeed, we filled the independent evaluation organization with a person who if he had accepted it, he chose not to, would have been the best person to be here rather than Shekhar, and that's Abhijit Banerjee, and along with Asa Dufflo, the person, the two people who I think have made this the big thing. So we offered him, but he chose not to come. But I think just to put Angus's talk in the context of that decision, Angus was absolutely careful to say that the bad words in his textbook are rigorous. I would add to that gold standard or something, which just because there's a one shot, it works. I don't think Angus would go even as far as to say that RCT is, in general, no better than other ways of doing it. I think he would simply not elevate RCT to something beyond what it is. But I think much of what he said, especially in this first slide, which is the need for assumptions, a certain independence on causality, and keeping things simple, has very useful things at nil terms. And those are the things that RCT does. But I think it was a very, let me say, provocative for some and hilarious for others talk on what now passes for the gold standard, Shaker.